Actually, I think the catalyst was the day my sister came home with a VHS copy of the film Hackers from Blockbuster. And this film has a powerful message for a geeky 16-year-old boy. Basically, if you break into computers, Angelina Jolie will take her clothes off. So that I felt was worth exploring, probably my best shot. And Google didn't exist at the time, so I started Yahooing stuff. That never became a verb for some reason, unlike Google. And yeah, I just learned more about computers, operating systems, how these things work together. Discovered this kind of underground culture of hackers and chat rooms. And it was interesting because it was quite elitist, but in a very good way. Like things like spelling were very important. Like people really showcased their intelligence and tried to compete with each other. I think now hacking has become quite the large criminal enterprise. Back then it was just teenage kids doing it for curiosity, for a challenge, something like that. So we really didn't grasp the fact that we were actually malicious. We weren't super destructive. We'd sometimes deface a website. At one point, the Spice Girls website may have been photoshopped to remove all their hair. I had nothing to do with that. At that time, you had it's probably still around. I'm pretty sure it's still around. Internet Relay Chat is what it's called, IRC, and you connect to networks. There was FNet, there was Undernet, there were different networks. And in those networks, they have dozens of servers, which were great because sometimes they would get disconnected and a bunch of people would just disappear from the chat room. And you'd have certain channels that had hackers in them, whatnot, and sometimes they were open, sometimes you get an invite, and you just kind of got to know people the same way you do at a cooking class or whatever, what have you. And after about a year and a half, I sort of semi-accidentally broke into a nuclear weapons facility in India about a month after they set off 5 atomic bombs underground as part of some tests. And no one even knew they had an active nuclear weapons program at the time. So the United Nations was up in arms. I remember it was on the news all the time, and I broke into this thing. Didn't actually know what it was when I broke into it. Punched in the IP address that I had just hacked into a web browser, and then saw, that's the thing from the news. And then just went back in and downloaded all the research. And that made me very popular with apparently the CIA, NSA, DIA, FBI, Pakistani ISI. Angelina was nowhere to be found. So that's kind of where the hacking started. A lot of people really don't understand how hacking works, how computer security works, because you see it in films very often of like, oh, there's a firewall. I'll just chip away at it. Boom, I'm in. It's like, yeah, they spent 20 million on network security, so you could just do that for 5 minutes and go in. No, it doesn't work that way at all. It's basically software applications or server services. They will have faults in them that allow you to make it do something unexpected. And usually these things are disclosed by the manufacturer before any big problem happens. A patch is released. Unfortunately, most organizations are terrible at actually deploying those things, even though it's fairly easy for some reason. And in this case, what was used, someone asked me this recently. I rarely actually talk about this, but what it was a mail server that was running basically the application that you send it an email, it takes it, it routes it to the right place. They were running an old version. They hadn't updated it. It had a vulnerability. And the vulnerability it's called a dead letter vulnerability. So the dead letter file was back then, because we're talking 25 plus years ago now, any email that was undeliverable would get sent to this file. However, it was possible to basically tell it what file to use to override the default setting, which obviously you shouldn't be able to do, but you could send an email and ask part of the email, by the way, if you can't deliver this, send it over here. The system should check for that, but it didn't, or it didn't do it properly. So instead of the dead letter file, which should just be a file full of emails, I told it the dead letter file is the password file. So I literally just emailed myself an account with a password into the system's password file. And then I was able to log in with that username and password I just made up. It checked its file. Yeah, that's a valid account, and it gave me access. I didn't really know what it was initially. And I remember then putting into the web browser, which was Netscape at the time, seeing what it was. And then I was like, oh crap. And I was like, where would I go on the server to get something interesting? And that's what I thought, let's go for the email. Let's go for the email. I just broke into an email server. It makes sense. We just downloaded all the correspondence from all the scientists and whatnot. And that was then handed over to a reporter at Wired Magazine, who I believe sent it to the CIA. Although there was a story on CNET that the NSA monitored the whole thing in real time, apparently. So, yeah, I couldn't make heads or tails of nuclear research. I kind of dropped out of school at that point, and I was always surrounded by all these other hackers. Most of them were somewhere in Europe, but most of them were in the States. And I think especially late 90s, like all the IT work and all that stuff was in the States. And for me, it was like, well, that's the future. I'm going to go to the States. And I literally just bought a one-way flight to the state. I remember like boxing my computer up in these cardboard boxes and just shipping. I was living with my dad at the time. We didn't really talk very much. I literally just kind of left one day and didn't come back. Um, and yeah, and I ended up uh, just going to the States, slightly overstaying my tourist visa. And one day there were 4 suits at the front door. And one had a badge from the Defense Department. And they came in, and I was like, there was, I remember in the media, a report of that someone had hacked into this Indian facility using a US Defense Department computer. Wasn't me, but it was how it was reported. In fact, it was my first kind of exposure to media not always being actual or factual. So I told him, look, I was in Holland at the time. This was in India. The U.S. military computer thing, that wasn't me. So I know you don't have any proof because that literally wasn't me. I was worried you guys were from immigration. And that's when suit number 4 in the back of the room went, I'm from immigration. And yeah, I was promptly handcuffed, put in the back of a van, taken to a facility 1 or 2 hours drive away. I still to this day don't know where it was. It was around 10 o'clock at night. It was after lockdown. They put me in a cell, and I was pretty sure I was going to get murdered. And the next morning, when the cells opened and everyone kind of, exits out into the central population. But the first words I heard were, "Dude, are you from Amsterdam?" And everyone thought I was really cool, and I taught them all how to commit credit card fraud. But I'm, equally helpful to everyone. So I remember helping the guards. I was like, hey, the cell door, the locking mechanism, I can get some toilet paper from my toilet and wet it and block it. So when you hit the button in the guard booth, it won't lock the door. They thanked me for this with a bright orange t-shirt that said escaped risk. That made me really unpopular with everybody else, which made me very lonely, but only for a couple of days because then some more suits came. And they made me a job offer I couldn't refuse. And they were quite adamant about the couldn't refuse part. And then I spent 3 years sort of getting paid large amounts of cash by federal agents in underground car parks. Most of what I did was kind of intelligence, gathering intelligence on who was out there, who was doing what, who was breaching. This is like 1998, 1999. There wasn't really much in terms of the government. There were no agencies dealing with this stuff. So weirdly enough, like we worked out of a corporate relocation apartment because it's an undercover funding rule. You have to have an undercover location to work out of, even though we're just behind the computer most of the time. And just talking, gathering intelligence, who's breaking into what, building their trust, getting information from them. Sometimes, maybe not. Following people through systems, that kind of stuff.
Like civilians or officials?
Some civilians, some more on the kind of terrorist angle. There were some very interesting things where there was one guy who kept threatening to kill me, who turned out to be an FBI informant. So there's some interesting things. There were some, a few times I actually had to go meet people in person. There was one person who stole some rather sensitive data about some pretty significant weapon systems. So it was about meeting him and trying to figure out what's going on with this data, where is it going, this and that. That was my first time wearing a wire, which back in the 90s was an interesting concept. the actual microphones are these tiny little metal blades that just pick up the vibration, and then they go down with the actual wire, and they're secured to like an iPod-sized recording device, which they tape somewhere very private. And then I remember getting a bit warm, which was awkward, but not nearly as awkward as having to remove the tape at the end of the night. I could hear the agency, the adjacent room, laughing as I was tugging.
Did you go through any training? Did they prep you for this sort of stuff?
No, actually, they really didn't. I remember my first meeting, and I was like, we'd feigned that I stole a bunch of equipment and maybe some business could be done with this guy. And he was down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And this is very like James Bond spy-like. And I'm like asking, like, where, like, let's meet for dinner. Like, where do you want to go? And I'm imagining some fancy, nice, posh restaurant, something. Hooters. He chose Hooters. So we're having this dinner in Hooters, kind of building up a rapport and stuff. And not a whole lot happened. And then I remember getting back into the car that they'd rented for me and being told to go to an airfield, basically. And I couldn't understand why I was going to an airfield. And it was because they actually had aerial surveillance of my dinner with a small plane circling.
Which you didn't know about.
I didn't know about. And once I got to the airfield, about half the people in the restaurant were there. They completely filled the restaurant with police officers and federal agents. So that's quite impressive, the amount of resource. And they kind of, you've just pointed out, I never really thought about it. They really threw me in there blind with no training whatsoever. But they actually did put a lot of resource to make sure I was fine. Officially, I was basically set up as a witness. And they would pay me, you can have funds to pay for what do they call it? I don't know, a confidential informant type situation where you pay the person for information, except usually it's information the person already has. I was sort of sent out to get the information. And it ended up lasting about 3 years. After 9/11, things got a little bit weird because now all of a sudden they wanted me to like infiltrate Al-Qaeda and kind of terrorist organizations. I'm not really qualified for this. But also the political sphere became very weird because in the US, it became very kind of nationalistic, USA, USA. And you'd have like people in Washington reviewing my chat logs, trying to win favor with potential terrorists or people affiliated with terrorism. But obviously, I'm not going to say USA #1, America is bloody great. You have to show them sympathy and the fact that I was saying negative things about the US, they were like, "Oh, this guy's not a very good patriot. He hates our country." Like, no, I'm saying those things to infiltrate these people. It was really weird, but yeah, those people could have shut down the operation or got me in trouble as well. So it was a very weird thing to navigate. And I have Dutch citizenship. I ended up finding a job in the Netherlands. And yeah, I actually remember telling it to them and one of the FBI agents just saying, "Is it the money? Because we can get you more."
So I've read that at some point you were deemed one of the world's top 5 most infamous hackers.
I was never on the FBI's most wanted. People have completely made that up. I did once see some magazine have a top 5 and the group I was in, Millworm, was listed on there. One of the other ones was Kevin Mitnick. I have been specifically mentioned in one of his books a couple of times because he was arrested. Now, he was actually more of a social engineer than an actual hacker, but he is the person who was detained the longest in history without a trial, without his phone call. I think almost 2 years, because they were afraid if they gave him a phone, he could set off a nuclear war. That's how scared of him they were. Yeah, and then he eventually got out of prison, started out various security consultancies and stuff, but yeah.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We love making videos, meeting people and letting them tell their stories.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are and would like a bit more,
We've just launched the series as a podcast on Spotify.
It's the full interviews uncut, so you can hear the whole thing wherever you are, at home or on the go.
But no matter where you're watching the content, please remember to like, comment and subscribe as it really helps the channel.
And don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us who you'd like us to talk to next.
Thank you. Now, back to our story.
Okay, cool.
The skills involved in hacking are not the skills you need to secure an organization. An organization is not a computer. And when you do things like ethical hacking or even, vulnerability scanning, these tools that find the security vulnerabilities, you'll find a security vulnerability, but no one's asking themselves why they have that vulnerability. We explained the nuclear weapon sites, this vulnerability defect in the mail server, basically. But if you really think about it, every security vulnerability it's a defect. It's a defect in how something's coded, how something's configured, how something's built, even like the life cycle of something. Vulnerabilities are discovered all the time in all kinds of applications. But the manufacturers, the producers of that software will usually release a patch that you can apply and you fixed it. But, is your patching process any good? Are you able to deploy it? Do you have visibility to those systems? Did you not consider the life cycle of that system of, hey, we have to take this down for 5 minutes every couple of days just to be able to install patches? Oh, no, we can't. And that's how these vulnerabilities really accumulate. And the whole security industry is kind of based on addressing these symptoms, but rarely the cause. And I think we are seeing, the security industry is almost complicit in this. We have a massive problem where every year we are spending more on cybersecurity, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. So the total amount is going up, but also the amount as a percentage of company spending is going up. And you would expect a decrease in incidents and this frequency and scale of incidents, and it's not. It's exponentially increasing. And I was invited to a meeting with a member of parliament last year and some 20 other cybersecurity leaders about shaping the UK cybersecurity strategy. And it was all about ramping up how much cybersecurity we're doing. How do we get people to invest more, spend more money on it? But everyone's ignoring the fact it's not working. It's not fundamentally working. Why would you keep doubling down on something where the trend is just getting worse and worse? And I think that's a problem because we really need to take a step back. And the quality angle is quite interesting because you look at every other industry. Cybersecurity is quite unique. I think cybersecurity is the only department in an organization where if you go to like a CEO or an executive, whatever, you ask them, how does a finance department work? How does an HR department work? How does sales operations? They'll have a pretty good idea. You ask them about cybersecurity, they have no idea. No idea whatsoever. And I often joke, it's the only job in the world where no one knows what you're supposed to be doing. No one knows whether you're actually doing it. And if you screw up bad enough, they double your budget. No other department works this way. And I was at an event, actually not far from here on Tower Bridge, like Christmas 4 years ago, where they had some senior leadership teams of different companies. There's mostly business questions. It was not a cyber event at all. And they asked them, what's the number one reason you fund your cybersecurity function? And when I asked that at conferences, I tell the story at conferences, like, what do you think they said? People are like, oh, ransomware, oh, compliance, or no. The number one reason they gave was, and I quote, to make the security people go away. That's the level of understanding that they have. And this lack of accountability from security is a really, really big problem. And no one's addressing why we have all these vulnerabilities. And it's becoming really, really bad. I think some of this is self-inflicted by security because people really have this notion now that security is a separate thing. Security is an outcome. Like you have to build things properly. You have to plan things properly. You have to have good culture, good processes, good code, good architecture. And that's what gives you a good outcome of security. Right now, what we're doing is we're building everything terribly. And we're giving people the freedom to do so because we've created this image that, oh, security is something you tack on after. And then we're trying to mitigate the disaster we've created by ramping up more and more and more. But it's impossible to keep up. You just can't. And the analogy I give is like securing an organization is a bit like keeping a ship afloat. The ship is in the water. The water's like all the threats out there. They're always trying to push their way in. And some will get in. It's inevitable. And that's why you have a bilge pump, which is kind of similar to your typical security function nowadays. And it's just whatever gets in, it addresses, it pumps out, and the ship stays afloat. However, if your ship is full of holes, there's millions of gallons of water coming in every minute, you could put 1,000 bilge pumps on that ship. It's going under. If, however, your ship is well built, you can have no bilge pump, and that thing will stay afloat for 12 months without a problem. And that's what we don't understand. And it's gotten to the point where the security is almost like a symptom of a bigger underlying problem. We're really not addressing that problem. For me, like the best thing a security function can do, now you have all these tech boffins in the basement. If you really want to secure an organization, go through your business's processes, business processes, IT processes, which is a subset of business processes, and figure out what is every department, every role supposed to be doing, and how can we achieve that while introducing the lowest amount of risk/defects possible. And where we do have to have a risk, at least we know about it. Right? So I used to audit. Usually if I say audit, people think some information security standard, ISO 27001, blah, blah, blah. No, I used to audit for portfolio work for a law firm that represented cyber insurance companies. And my job would be to go in into companies that had been breached and show that they were negligent so that the insurance didn't have to pay. 100% successful, never took me more than 3 hours. And it always comes down to the same thing. The security function doesn't have a clue of what's going on in the business. Go into your company and see how much they know about the IT help desk, which is in IT, is very close to them. They're giving access to stuff all day long. 99% chance the security team won't have a clue what processes they follow to give people access, let alone the HR department, finance, operations, sales. They don't have a clue. And I would go into these organizations that had just been breached, through their finance department or through their marketing or whatever. And they knew nothing about how that department worked, which fair enough, because this stuff takes time and you've just come on board as the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and you'll need some time to get through this. But then I would ask them, when were you planning on getting to it? And even if it was like next year or in 2 years, then at least you had a plan. You got caught out before you could deploy your plan. But they all just look at me funny. It's like, never. Why would we? Because you're in charge of securing the organization. You don't even know how the organization works. It's getting pretty bad. In the past, because there was a lot of kind of bureaucracy and some old, people complain about legacy systems, but legacy systems are fairly robust and simple. Now it's becoming increasingly complex. We saw the power outages in Spain. Some groups have taken credit for it, and we've seen significant outages a few years ago now. But the thing that took down Maersk, which was basically being used, it was something the Russians used against a piece of Ukrainian accounting software, but because Maersk operated in Ukraine, it got into their systems worldwide and just basically shut them down completely. And they got extremely lucky because they had so in Windows, you have something called Active Directory, which is like the kind of directory structure of the whole network and how everything talks to each other. It's basically like a big phone book of how to find everything. They got extremely lucky because there was a power outage in Nigeria. So one system there wasn't affected. And they actually flew with a private jet to go get that computer to rebuild that phone book. But it's getting worse and worse. One thing I find quite interesting is, on iPhone or your Mac, you have it generate that password. It's like 6 digits, a dash, 6 digits, numbers, whatever. There's no way someone's guessing that. Okay, there's absolutely no way. Completely random. I have hundreds of notifications, some of which are from fairly big websites, where it tells me your password's been compromised. Now, I've only used that password there. There's no way to have cracked it or guessed it. That means that site's been compromised, and they never disclose it to anyone. But because we're not addressing root cause in a simple way, we're layering more and more and more kind of defensive tech, we're creating more complexity and more dependency at the same time. So there's a higher likelihood of stuff breaking as well. So it's not just... And the threat ecosystem is also growing because we're accumulating this backlog of issues. People worry a lot about the threat environment out there, and it's crazy. It's scary. You go on the dark web, you can buy 1,000 valid email addresses and passwords to just about every organization you want for like 20 quid. Like, it's really, really easy. It's quite scary. And that just keeps growing and growing and growing. And until we stop producing so many vulnerabilities and if I take a bag of grain and I stick it in my front garden, am I really surprised if a week later I've got a mouse infestation? Well, the solution is not to buy 10,000 mousetraps and try to catch them all. But that's ridiculous. You have to, find some better solution for storing the grain. We see like security people and hackers as these like, we cannot understand them. They're this mysterious beast, really. That's what normal people look like to them. For them, having like a normal conversation with a different department about modifying a business process is equally like, so there's this big divide there. So, the bag of grain example, ask a business question. What do we use this grain for? Oh, well, every 3 months we load it in the tractor to see the field. Okay, can we just get it delivered the day we need it, put directly in the tractor and get rid of this whole area here that we have to manage? That's a risk. Sometimes it's that simple, but no one in IT or especially in security ever bothers finding out, why do we do stuff? Like I run a consultancy now, and I've gone into places where they're maintaining infrastructure that's very difficult to maintain. It's got a lot of legacy stuff. They're constantly complaining about it. They don't know what it does. Like they've never asked, like, what does this actually do? And can we maybe change the business process to get rid of it? And sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes things have been going on for like 3 or 4 years. Companies are spending hundreds of thousands per year on something they absolutely didn't need, but no one ever asked the questions. Like when I was working with the insurance companies, they're trying to figure out, they have all the security stuff. They're still getting compromised. Or we looked at organizations that spend significantly less on security, but actually had more mature IT processes and business processes. They were 6 times less likely to get breached than companies that spent 10 times more on cybersecurity, because those are just the Band-Aids. Whereas they were actually, they had the hygiene, they had the quality, things were fitting well. The hull of the ship was watertight. And that's far more important. Working as a CISO, I spent 80% of my security budget on IT tools and process improvement, not cybersecurity stuff. So as an ordinary person, what would you do? Use strong passwords, be smart. One big thing that we're seeing is like kind of the deep fake phenomenon. Like it's possible now to simulate just about anything. Your bank is probably not calling you, asking you for your credit card details. Don't give credentials, credit card numbers over the phone and whatnot. Sometimes that's legitimate if you know them. The basic things, use strong passwords. We mentioned the iPhone tells you when something's been compromised. Do that. But generally in the UK, in Europe, actually, there's very little issue with identity theft because every other country in Europe has national ID cards, which, you could argue it from a privacy perspective, but it's very, very hard to actually acquire someone's identity. In the UK, it's more like if I've got 3 utility bills, I'm that person. So that's a bit, but generally compared to the US, things are a bit safer for the consumer here. If you're being contacted by something, for example, if someone calls you, call them back. Look up the real number. That will usually keep you safe most of the time. If you're working maybe a job where you're handling financial transactions, validate things as best as you can. Talk to the person physically as well, because I think it can be quite helpful to. You've got to use your brain, but in order to use your brain, you have to understand what's possible. So people do SIM jacking where they'll take over a phone number, this or that. So try ask something that only the other person would know. Just use the stuff from spy movies. I don't know what to tell you, but generally, I think you're all right. I think the biggest risk to consumer is, what if something really bad happens to infrastructure, that kind of thing. But hopefully we'll be all right for now.